Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this Menil Drawing Institute presentation by Charles Mark Haxthausen on Cy Twombly. My name is Edward Kopp. I'm the Menil Drawing Institute Chief Curator here at the Menil. And the Menil Drawing Institute is a program of the Menil collection that really aims to foster scholarship on and also the public appreciation of the drawing medium through collecting, exhibitions, publications, and also fellowships. Our fellowship program is really at the heart of our activities, and Charles Mark Haxthausen was a senior research fellow here at the Drawing Institute in spring 2025. And before I introduce Mark, I just want to point out that this presentation is based on a public lecture he gave at the Drawing Institute in March 2025. So Mark is Robert Sterling Clark Professor of Art History Emeritus at Williams College, and he served as director of the graduate program there from 1993 to 2007. In 2009, he was recipient of the College Art Association's Award for Distinguished Teaching of Art History. And in 2012, his exhibition Sol le Wit, The Well-Tempered Grid, which took place at Williams College Museum of Art, received an award of excellence from the American Association of Museum Curators. He has published widely on modern contemporary art and also art criticism with a focus on Germany. His publications include Berlin, Culture and Metropolis, of which he was co-editor and was published by Minnesota University Press in 1990. And also he published The Two Art Histories, The Museum and the University, a volume of essays of which he was editor. This was published by Yale in 2002. And last but not least, Karl Einstein, A Mythology of Forms, Selected Writings on Art, which consisted of his translations and extensive commentary. And also Mark is currently completing a very important book, reassessing Paul Klee's position in the European avant-garde. So while at the Menil, Mark focused his research on the work of Cy Twombly and the issue of temporality. And his stay coincided with the 30th anniversary of the Cy Twombly Gallery on the Menil campus. So Mark, welcome. It's great to see you again. And now the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Edouard. It's an occasion to thank you for inviting me to the Menil and to work on Cy Twombly, a long-term interest of which I had never really pursued. And also to thank the wonderful staff at the Drawing Institute and at the Menil collection in general, who've been very supportive of my research throughout my time there. So thank you once again. One of my favorite observations on the experience of time comes toward the end of Act 1 of Richard Strauss's opera Der Rosenkavalier, with libretto by Hugo von Hofmannsthal. It goes like this: time, it's an odd thing. As you live your life, it's really nothing at all. But then suddenly one senses nothing but time. It's all around us. It's even within us. In 1994, when Cy Twombly was in his mid-60s, an interviewer related that he likes to say he has no sense of time. Twombly elaborated, "Sometimes when I'm writing the date on a letter, I have to ask what year it is." In this instance, he was referring only to calendrical time. Yet I find there is a very strong sense, indeed, many senses of time in his art. A sense of time is integral to the effect of much of his work, manifesting itself in different ways. I'm not alone in this observation. In the burgeoning literature on Twombly, there are many references to time. I show you a recent example from 2023, the splendid exhibition, Cy Twombly, Making Past Present, curated by Christine Condolian at Boston's Museum of Fine Arts, which explored Twombly's deep engagement with Greco-Roman antiquity. Yet, to the best of my knowledge, no one has systematically explored the different ways in which Twombly's engagement with temporality manifests itself in his art. My paper today is a modest initial step in that project. At the outset, I want to emphasize that much of what I have to say is based on the works in the Menil Twombly Gallery, on repeatedly viewing the actual objects in space and time over a 3-month period. In the Twombly Gallery, one can truly say in Hofmannsthal's phrase, "Time is all around us." I could not have written this lecture without that experience, and for that opportunity, I'm immensely grateful to the Menil Drawing Institute and its director, Eduard Kopp. The origin of my interest in this topic dates to 2005 when the Whitney Museum mounted the exhibition Cy Twombly 50 Years of Works on Paper. At the time, I got around to reading Kirk Varnado's catalog of Moment's 1994 Twombly retrospective. I still regard his text as the best overview of his art. One passage in particular stimulated my thinking. Varnado describes Twombly during his early years in Rome, walking from his apartment on the Via de Monserrato to his studio in the Piazza del Biscione. I quote, "When he moved there, Twombly's home on the Via di Monserrato was in a decayed area still infested with petty thieves, and the studio in the Piazza del Biscione, set above a cheap movie house and overlooked a ripe zone of prostitution. Walking home from his studio, Twombly passed not only to the august Rome of the Caesars and the Baroque popes, but also through this environment of coarsely vital contemporary existence." End of quote. It struck me that many of Twombly's works, like Apollo and the Artist, shown here, inverted that process. In form and technique, it's emphatically modern, has nothing whatsoever to do with classical antiquity, yet, incongruously, the name of the god Apollo is freely scrawled in block letters and blue crayon across a patch of white paint. Above it in graphite, Delos, the birthplace of the god, appears in cursive script, as if written by another hand. It's as if irreverent time travelers, vandals from ancient Greece, had defaced the work. The operation of graffiti is reversed. The past is invasively inscribed onto the present. Twombly's interest in time is evident virtually from the beginning of his career. His 3-month stay in Morocco in 1952 to 53 had a decisive impact in this regard. In 1956, in a proposal for a travel grant, Twombly wrote that, "Generally speaking, my art has evolved out of the interest in symbols abstracted and a deeply aesthetic sense of eroded or ancient surfaces of time." Varnado, contrasting Twombly's experience of North Africa with that of Delacroix, Matisse, and Paul Klee, for whom color was paramount, wrote, "The lasting impression evident in these 1953 paintings was of white, evoking the brightness of the Mediterranean sun through echoes of crumbling chalk, bleached bone, and eroded lime. This aesthetic is evident in Twombly's paintings of 1953-54, and especially in his later sculptures." A rich example of this, the earliest painting in the Menil Twombly Gallery, Volubilis, painted in 1953 in New York following his return to the States. Its title refers to the best preserved ancient Roman site in Morocco. Its medium is house paint, oil, crayon, and charcoal on canvas, with which Twombly mixed dirt to dull the whites to simulate the effect of time. The Menil's Nathalie Dupaché has written a fundamental article on these Moroccan works. She observes how, I quote, "the slurried ridges of paint indelibly recall the furrows of the excavated Moroccan field, reproducing in different materials the appearance and the archaeological operations of the site they name." End quote. Christine Condolian writes of how many of Twombly's paintings, quote, "give the appearance of erosion, of being scratched and revealing only parts, like buried bits." Twombly's art evolved rapidly in these years. He was in his mid-20s. In his Untitled, a painting from the following year, 1954, executed in house paint, crayon, and graphite, he lightened the graphic texture from that in Volubilis. Dense clusters of rapid crayon strokes contrast with delicate single filaments of graphite, yet the canvas has a dim, soiled look, partly from smudges of charcoal, but more from the dark, taupe-colored stains and smears. The surface appears to be the product not merely of the artist's hand, but of accidents and accretions of matter over time. A conditioned report from June of last year is telling. It notes a burn mark in the upper right quadrant. Dislodged pieces of dried paint and studio detritus, including paper, fibers, and wood fragments, can be seen embedded in the paint film. A layer of dirt is embedded and loosely adhered throughout the painting. Carol Mancusi Ungaro, who prepared the report, notes that Twombly told her in reference to an earlier painting he had rubbed Virginia dirt into the wet paint using cloth and turpentine. Anticipating a reaction to this surface, Twombly attached a note to the verso of the work. "Do not ever clean or restore this painting." Signed and dated April 26, 2001. After 1954, I don't see evidence of this aesthetics of erosion in Twombly's painting. Yet it lives on in his sculptures throughout his career. Frequently constructed from diverse materials, they usually incorporate plaster, white paint, and old discarded bits or objects of wood, as in this work, Untitled from 1985. Here you can see the aged wooden box that is the basis of the sculpture, as well as the fine web of cracks on the top. As Katharina Schmidt observed in her essential publication on Twombly sculptures, with its lid, this object has assumed the shape of a small sarcophagus, an association reinforced by the central placement of a leaf at its head. This interpretation is supported by Twombly's sighting of the object in the room of the Twombly Gallery dedicated to his five-part painting, Analysis of the Rose as Sentimental Despair, everything dating from 1985. It is placed on an axis with the fourth painting in the cycle, which at its head bears an inscription adapted from the poet Rainer Maria Rilke's epitaph for his own grave. Rose, O sheer contradiction, desire to be no one's sleep beneath so many lids. The linkage is reinforced by the barely decipherable inscription of the word rose that you see in this slide on the in the middle there, and on this detail on the right, by the word rose on the side of the box in the same red pigment. The gallery becomes a kind of memorial chapel for one of Twombly's favorite poets. Other sculptures by Twombly thematize mortality, recalling the medium's historical memorial function. This one, which is in fact titled Epitaph, cites a verse from the 7th century BC Greek soldier poet Archilochus, whom Twombly identified as his favorite poet. In the hospitality of war, we left them their dead as a gift to remember us by. This one, Untitled, in memory of Alvaro de Campos, is a memorial to a fictive person. Alvaro de Campos was one of many heteronyms created by the modern Portuguese author Fernando Pessoa, who published his work under the names of invented authors, each of whom had a distinctive biography, literary personality, and style. Untitled, in memory of Babur, commemorates the 16th century founder of the Mughal Empire, whose mausoleum Twombly visited in Kabul, Afghanistan, and of which he thereafter kept a photo by his bedside. One purpose of the rhetoric of tombs and memorials cut from stone is to create a sense of permanence in the face of death, to counteract the transience of the physical world. Twombly's constructions out of wood, plaster, paint, putty, and graphite deviate from that rhetoric. The wispiness of the spindly graphite inscription, compare it with the incised tablet at Babur's tomb, conveys a sense of fragility and fugitiveness. Ironically, Twombly's own memorial with an epitaph in Latin in the church Santa Maria in Vallicella in his Rome neighborhood conforms to conventional practice. Now to return to Twombly's painting. In 1955, he turned 27 that year. There is an abrupt shift toward lightness, transparency, and an exhilarating fleetness of touch. He achieves this in part by simplifying his means. The heavy clustered marks of crayon, which accounted for the graphic weight of the 1954 Untitled, shown on the left, disappear, and pencil, graphite supplemented occasionally by colored pencil, becomes the dominant means of mark making on canvases coated with creamy white house paint. Academy, measuring a little over 6 by 8 feet, is a representative example. In these works, we no longer find the cultivation of the appearance of erosion over time. time is present in another way, in the dynamism of line, recording the swift movement of Twombly's hand. In 1957, in a statement published in an Italian journal, he had the following to say: "Most painting defines the image. It is at this point that I break with the more general process of painting. Each line is now the actual experience with its own innate history. It does not illustrate. It is the sensation of its own realization." End quote. In other words, line has no referent other than the gesture that produced it. Here I introduce a distinction. It is between what I'm calling horizontal time and vertical time. What I'm calling horizontal time is exemplified by these fluid lines realizing themselves, to adopt Twombly's term, across the surface of the painting, what he calls the line's own innate history. But there's another temporal dimension, another history of lines previously laid down, being partially effaced through overpainting. These too are marks of innate history, of the painting's history, of Twombly's process, his decisions and revisions during the painting's making. Condolian writes of how in Twombly's paintings, partially exposed underpainted layers emerge, thereby creating an archaeology of painted surfaces. I found that one productive way to look at and think about Twombly is in terms of the artwork's referent. What does it signify? Works like Untitled from 1954 or Academy from 1955 can be said to be autonomous, self-sufficiently visual, to signify themselves. They don't inevitably lead the mind to anything outside the painting. Most of Twombly's paintings from 1956 through 1959 are untitled. In this regard, there's a big shift at the turn of the decade. There are references in the form of inscriptions that refer to something outside the canvas, something that is not visible. In 1959, only 4 of 25 paintings had titles. In 1960, when Twombly completed 49 paintings, 29 had titles, all but 2 of them relating to the history of art or classical mythology. The Age of Alexander in the Twombly Gallery is a key work in this respect. Here we find a completely different style from that of Academy, and I want to argue a different experience of time. To begin with, there is no unifying ground of house paint, but bare primed canvas. Twombly now introduces oil paint, applying it thickly but sparingly, along with graphite and crayon, with the former as the primary medium. In place of a fluid all-over thicket of linear tracery, we have scattered graphic incidents, textural inscriptions, and isolated daubs of oil paint. If you find it hard to get a visual fix on this painting from this slide, it is no different in the gallery. As I shall shortly argue, that I see as deliberate. The title is coy. The Alexander referred to is not Alexander the Great, but Twombly's son, Cyrus Alessandro, who was just 2 weeks old. The age referred to is his age as he begins his life. Here you see his name neatly printed, framed by 2 X's beside a thick, vehement protuberance of white oil paint. Easily overlooked, it is the smallest, neatest inscription in the painting. In fact, one of the neatest in any Twombly painting. What then are we to make of all the other inscriptions? Much more conspicuous. This multitude of inscriptions is new in his art. Above in the upper left of this detail, you see the word valley. What is its significance? I stumbled across a possible explanation when I discovered Twombly's memorial plaque, his recently occupied home in the Via di Monserrato, where he painted this work, is minutes on foot from the church of Santa Maria in Vallicella, which means Little Valley. That's the church I showed earlier, where Twombly's ashes would have their final resting place. Was Cyrus Alessandro perhaps baptized there? Or is it there simply because the Baroque church is a neighborhood landmark? In any case, who outside of Twombly's intimate circle would get the reference? Other inscriptions remain obscure. Near the bottom of the canvas, near the center, Sempre, why my heart in your birth as death for even now, 1960. Above it, in the upper right of the slide, the word sad flight, and directly below what looks like a child's sketch of a submarine. There are other inscriptions for which I'm not showing details. Floods. Why cry anymore? Kill what? In the upper right, an inscription inspired by a poem by Mallarmé. What wing can be held? Moreover, throughout the canvas, there are many instances of numbers usually arranged in sequence. It's difficult to find any unifying theme that would relate these inscriptions. I do, however, have a theory about what is happening here. It is this. There is a dimension of random mental activity, fleeting thoughts that occur involuntarily during the act of painting, mental activity not related to the act of painting. Back in the day, I was myself a painter and was annoyed by this. I regarded it as evidence of a lack of focus. Twombly, if my theory is correct, embraced it, ran with it. He chose to incorporate traces of that random mental activity in the form of words and phrases, residues of a process unfolding in time, a process that included elements not related to the act of painting. If this is indeed the case, the Age of Alexander can be seen as a cumulative index of the act of its creation, a record not only of the activity of the hand, but of the mind as well, even when the two work independently of one another. I think it particularly noteworthy that this work coincides with the emergence of minimalism and its dogmatic rejection of non-visual content. Here I show you a Frank Stella painting in the Menil collection from the same year as the Age of Alexander. In an oft-quoted interview from 1964, Stella complained of people who assert that there is something there besides the paint on the canvas. My painting is based on the fact that only what can be seen there is there. All I want anyone to get out of my paintings, and all I ever get out of them, is the fact that you can see the whole idea without any confusion. What you see is what you see. His interviewer responds, that doesn't leave too much afterward, does it? Stella, I don't know what else there is. For Twombly, there is clearly a great deal afterwards. There is a paradox at the heart of the Age of Alexander, a conspicuous gap between the time of execution and the time of viewing. Because graphite is the primary medium, the work is only faintly visible from a distance. As an image, it doesn't hold a wall. The viewer must move in very close to this vast canvas, roughly 10 by 16.5 feet, surveying it piecemeal to perceive the individual marks and inscriptions. And this reinforces the sense of randomness and disconnectedness in the painting. Yet the work, rather than being a discontinuous accretion of marks over an extended period, was executed in the course of several hours. On New Year's Eve, 1959, on the right side, Twombly inscribed what you see below, 7 p.m., and above it, 1959 into 1960. Yet with its disconnected jottings and scribbles, it seems an accretion of marks added over time rather than the product of a unitary artistic process. The painting that hangs to the left on the wall adjacent to the Age of Alexander, titled Hyperion, to Keats, there are several inscriptions. A dash or space RES, referring to the Greek name of Mars, perhaps, the words anew and mirror, Venus and Mars. These last three are barely discernible in this detail on the right, of which I framed the inscription of Venus, written in cursive script. These faint traces become visible to the beholder, if at all, only after protracted close looking. The title refers to a specific work by John Keats, his unfinished epic poem Hyperion. Yet this is not so straightforward as it seems. On the right edge of the painting, Twombly inscribed Part 3, and below it, partly obscured by a bundle of pencil strokes, Endymion, a different poem by Keats. And in fact, Mars and Venus do appear in that poem, but not in Hyperion. Below this inscription, Twombly has written, for Keats, but he has canceled that line by scribbling over it, and yet the painting subtitle is to Keats. What's going on here? What is significant, I believe, is that this suggests, playfully I would submit, a change of mind in the process of execution. For me, the significance of this is that it evokes an unfolding process of thinking, Revision's not merely a form, but of thinking and the act of creation. In the 1954 Untitled, or Academy of 1955, the canvas bears witness to a manual process of its creation. In Hyperion, as in the Age of Alexander, we have in the form of words traces not merely of a material process, but of a mental one. To turn Stella's remark on its head, there is something there besides the paint on the canvas, but the evidence for it is merely a trace. I want to make another point here about the fragmentary nature of many of Twombly's inscriptions, such as we find in Hyperion and the Age of Alexander. Their very fragmentary nature is a stimulus to the imagination, an activation of the mind of the viewer, a stimulus to the formation of images, and in this regard they share a feature with the work of one of his favorite poets, the 7th to 6th century BC poet Sappho, of whose work he owned 6 editions of translations. Already in 1959, there is a work dedicated to Sappho. Sappho was one of the most admired of ancient poets, yet her corpus survives as a collection of ruins. Condolian compares what remains of her poetry to the broken fragments of classical sculpture. Of the 9 volumes and roughly 10,000 lines of verse, Sappho is believed to have written only two complete poems, and 650 lines survive. Here, too, is an example of Twombly's engagement with transience. I can imagine that part of Sappho's appeal to Twombly is the sense we get from these surviving shreds of papyrus of the material dimension of language, something that is such a prominent feature of his own inscriptions. Words are not just signs that awaken concepts in the mind, inscribed, printed, or incised. They are also matter. In Twombly's paintings, drawings, and sculptures, we experience words as matter, not only as linguistic signs. A good example is this sheet from 1989, Untitled. It's a citation of Archilochus, the poet we encountered earlier in Twombly's sculpture, Epitaph. It's with a few exceptions, his poetry survives only as fragments, sometimes no more than a phrase or even a single word. Here, Twombly has taken fragment 106 from Guy Davenport's 1980 anthology, Archilochus, Sappho, Alcman. Only 5 disconnected words survive of this poem: whine, concerns, weeps, inclines, crash. Twombly enumerates them and also includes at the top of the sheet Davenport's description of the material form in which they survive, quote, a thin ribbon of paper. In a series of paintings from the early to mid-1960s, Twombly engaged in a different kind of reference and a different relationship to time. The references are not textual inscriptions, but art historical references by means of titles. The referent in each case is another work, one created 3 or 4 centuries earlier, thus setting up a dialogue with the past. There are over 24 paintings with titles corresponding to the subjects of well-known Old Master paintings, usually with mythological subjects: The Rape of the Sabines, Narcissus, Leda and the Swan, The Birth of Venus, and others. The most frequent reference is to frescoes by Raphael. There is Il Parnaso, after the Vatican fresco of that name, 9 paintings titled either The School of Athens or Study for the School of Athens, after Raphael's most famous Vatican fresco, and this one, in the Menil's Twombly Gallery, The Triumph of Galatea, Twombly's 3rd largest painting up to that time, only a few centimeters smaller than the Age of Alexander. It references the Raphael fresco in the Villa Farnesina in Rome, which you see on the left, and is a painting for which Twombly made 9 drawings. If one considers the original Renaissance of Baroque paintings as pictorial mediations of classical myths, then these paintings are mediations of those pictorial mediations. We have 3 temporal layers here. There would seem to be nothing obscure or elusive about the referent in these works, except in most cases, there are few, or if any, visual clues, no obvious relationship between Twombly's painting and the named work. With few exceptions, without the title, it is highly unlikely that anyone would get the reference. I'm inclined to see these paintings as encounters with art history in which Twombly uses the named work as a foil against which to assert his own conception of painting. By invoking the masters of the past, Twombly is situating, differentiating, and I would argue asserting himself within that tradition. And it's significant, I think, that Raphael has long been considered the master par excellence of the High Renaissance in Rome. But this is no act of homage. Twombly called Raphael, I quote, the most boring painter I know, aside from some of the portraits. This statement reminds me of a remark attributed to the 16th century Parmese master Correggio. When asserting his own artistic prowess, he was shown Raphael's Ecstasy of St. Cecilia in Bologna. Anch'io son pittore, he responded. I too am a painter. Here Twombly seems to make a similar statement in paint. I want to look at one more of these art historical references, one that refers not to a mythological subject, but to a modern painting that is itself a parody of an old master painting. This is Twombly's Dutch Interior, a work of 1961 in the Metropolitan Museum with a title evidently referring to three paintings Joan Miro did in 1928 with that title. What interests me here is this area of two conjoined hatched curvilinear shapes evoking breasts or buttocks. Twombly labels this detail. I regard this detail as a joke, but the effect is real. This suggests that this vast painting is preliminary to a work that he is imagining, that he envisions, but which is never realized. Another example is this detail in the painting, the second part of the Return from Parnassus, inscribed Reflection 1. But a reflection of what? Again, it suggests some process going on in Twombly's head that never culminates in a material image. The last example I want to consider for the sense of time in Twombly's art is one that emerges in the late 1960s. Its fullest realization is the largest painting in the Twombly Gallery, at 52 feet in width, the largest painting ever did. Say Goodbye, Catullus, to the Shores of Asia Minor, which was first shown at the Gagosian Gallery in Soho in 1994, at the time of Twombly's MoMA retrospective. Years later, at the time of Twombly's death, his friend and fellow artist Dorothea Rockburn described the effect of the installation, which I quote, "When I walked into the gallery, strikingly, there was only one painting, which covered the entire south wall. It was impossible to view the work, Say Goodbye, Catullus, to the Shores of Asia Minor, from very far back. In fact, the gallery had moved a wall to separate the street entrance from the exhibition, making the viewing space narrower than it normally was. Therefore, the only possible way to view the work was to begin at one end and walk alongside it." I've already discussed the role that the size of the canvas plays in our viewing of the Age of Alexander. This combination of extremely large format, the faintness of Twombly's graphite marks, and the random dispersal of those marks and inscriptions induce a directionless grazing of the eye over the vast surface. Beginning in 1966, Twombly becomes interested in a more directed sense of viewing, of guiding the viewer's experience of the painting as a progressive unfolding in space and time, such as described by Rockburn. This feature first appeared in several so-called blackboard paintings in 1966. In this one, untitled, we can see an early interest in a composition progressing from left to right, gaining in complexity, although the dimensions, 200 centimeters or 6.5 feet wide, remain within the norm for most of Twombly's paintings at this time. But soon in paintings with this sort of rightward progression, Twombly moved toward larger formats. A major example from November 1968 is Veil of Orpheus on 4 panels measuring roughly 7.5 by 16 feet. Here along the left edge at the beginning of a continuous graphite line extending across all 4 panels, Twombly has inscribed the words "Start Veil," and in the upper right corner where the line terminates, "End." In 1968, Twombly completed another multi-panel work, his largest painting to date, the first version of Treatise on the Veil, on 6 panels measuring roughly 8 1/3 by 24.5 feet. Here too, we have strong indicators of directionality. There is a horizontal movement of slender rectangles that gradually decrease in length from left to right. Several commentators have pointed out that the canvas is so wide, again it's 24.5 feet, that it's difficult to gain a synoptic view, and that to read the numbers inscribed in white wax crayon within and around the rectangles, one must move close to the canvas. The numbers give the approximate length of each rectangle. From left to right, 40 inches, 30, 28, 18, 8, 2.5. Because of its spareness and the simple rectangular forms, some authors have seen this painting as a response to minimalism, which was at its peak in these years. It should be noted that 4 years earlier, Twombly had received a devastating review from Donald Judd, one of the major minimal artists. Writing on a Twombly exhibition at the Castelli Gallery, Judd called the show a fiasco, writing that the works consisted of, I quote, a few drips and splatters and an occasional pencil line, concluding, there isn't anything to the paintings. Now, in Treatise on the Veil, there's a fascinating resemblance to a series of Judd's wall sculptures of these years known as progressions, which he began producing in 1964. Is this Twombly retorting to Judge, parroting him and his signature focus on rule-based proportions? Judge's sculpture is based on the Fibonacci sequence. Its underlying system is obvious to the eye. But what is the rule behind Twombly's sequence? I see neither rhyme nor reason to it. And why include the numbers at all? What do they add to our experience of the painting beyond drawing us in to be able to read them? I suggest the point of the numbers is a joke. They invite us to find an organizing principle, but there is none. They seem to send up a minimalist rule-based art making. It's another example of Twombly leaving visual traces of a mental process that remains obscure. There's this detail of a drawing by Judge from this period, which makes the relation even more striking. I should add that earlier that year, the Whitney Museum had presented a Donald Judd retrospective, which I assume Twombly must have seen. Crucial evidence for Twombly's exploration of progressive sequences at this time is a series of 12 drawings here in the collection of the Menil Drawing Institute, under the title Studies for the Treatise on the Veil. These are drawings ostensibly for this, the second version of the treatise painted in 1970. Unlike the Cologne version, this is on a single span of canvas. 10 meters or 33 feet long, 9 feet longer than the first version, and it's the largest work Twombly had painted up to then. In a conversation, he commented that this version is a more flowing and continuous line. The 1968 treatise is more broken and segmented. To reinforce the sense of progression, he inscribed in on the left edge of the horizontal strip and out at the termination of the right edge. The puzzling thing about the Menil drawings is that they have no obvious relation to this second version of treatise. All follow the Cologne version in dividing the work into separate panels. They are, to use Twombly's phrase, broken and segmented. All are dated 1970 in the catalogue raisonné of the drawings, and 10 bear a small ink stamp dating them to one of 2 days in late May of that year. The drawings are, with one exception, all collages. Twombly cut out sheets of paper or cardboard as models for the individual panels and experimented with arranging them in left to right sequences. There are 6 drawings with 6 panels and 4 with 5. Reinforcing the left to right progression, many of them have inscribed in on the left edge and out on the right edge, which is carried over in the second version and treatise on the veil. I mentioned that there is one exception to the collage technique. That is this drawing, the only one in which the panels are contiguous, as in the Cologne version, just as we see in the collage with the pasted and reproduction of that version. There is something else these two works have in common. Both have the number 69, the only drawings with that inscription, and I believe that may indicate that they were done in 1969, thus predating the other drawings. While Twombly preserves the format of the contiguous canvases, you will note that in contrast to the Cologne version, in the drawing on the right, he is differentiating the panels by means of the density of graphite strokes, lightening them from left to right. In 9 of the drawings, of which I show you 4 here, he is separating the panels into either 5 or 6, creating a sense of progression by means of a gradual lightening of marks, as in the top 2, or by different spatial intervals. Earlier this year, the likely outcome of this experimentation was on view in a show at the Gagosian Gallery in New York. when it exhibited this work, untitled, a 9-part painting from 1971. It is from the Twombly estate and had never been shown before. Significantly, it was not included in Volume 3 of the Catalogue Raisonné of the Paintings, published in 1994, when Twombly had 17 years still to live. From that, I concluded he was not happy with the work, and my own sense is that the tall, narrow format of the work cramped his style, which is not at all the case in many other works from 1971, such as the magnificent version of Untitled here in the Twombly Gallery. In this work, roughly 11 feet wide, we see another instance of Twombly's experimentation with a directed left-to-right progression. The painting forms a visual crescendo over a ground base of verticals, swelling in density and luminosity toward the center, then gradually diminishing to the right. These early examples of Twombly's interest in paintings with a left-right progression are all abstract. In his Hero in Leandro, a work of 1984, it assumes a narrative dimension. It is inspired by Christopher Marlowe's poem, Hero in Leander, completed by George Chapman after the poet's premature death at 29, and first published in 1598. The subject is the tragic love of Hero, a supposedly chaste priestess of Aphrodite, who lived in a tower on the European side of the Hellespont, now known as the Dardanelles, and Leander, who lived on the opposite shore of the 1.2-kilometer wide strait. For their nightly assignations, Leander would swim across the Hellespont every night, guided by the light of a lantern Hero placed in the tower. One stormy night, however, the wind blew out the lantern and Leander lost his way and drowned. This is a subject that attracted Twombly as early as 1962 and again in 1985. This 4-part version, begun in 1981 and completed in 1984, is an example of his interest in a progressive temporal experience of viewing. It consists of 3 painted panels, each just under 7 feet wide, together a little over 20 feet across, and a small sheet roughly 17 by 12 inches, with a graphite inscription from the marvelous closing lines of a sonnet by John Keats on the subject. He's gone, up bubbles all his amorous breath. This reinforces the sense of a left-to-right progression, functioning as a kind of epilogue or postscript. Yet I think that Twombly's conception for the work came not from Keats, but from a passage in George Chapman's completion of Marlowe's poem. Christine Condolian has written insightfully of the importance of sound in Twombly's inscriptions. She writes that his, I quote, graphic tracings invite us to read aloud and listen, and in so doing, we, like the artist, bridge the space between the eye, the ear, and the mind. This is pertinent, I believe, to why Twombly has changed the name to Leandro. The reason that the name takes the form it does here is aural. This may be inspired by the following passage in Chapman's completion of the poem, which emphasizes the sounding of his name, and I quote, "Her Leander, a name of all earth's jewels, pleased not her like his dear name. Leander, still my choice, come naught but my Leander. O my voice, turn to Leander. Henceforth be all sounds, accents and phrases that show all grief's wounds, analyzed in Leander. She fell on her love's bosom, hugged it fast, and with Leander's name she breathed her last." Twombly's inscription, which extends over half of the 6.5-foot wide canvas, evokes Hero's cry upon discovering her dead beloved. It rings out across the Hellespont, swelling in horror, "Leandro!" Ending with a consonant would not do it. It has to be a vowel. And like an echo extending in time, faint traces of single letters from his name are barely visible in the central and right panels, as though drowned out by the roar of the stormy sea. Time. Whenever we are before the image, we are before time. These are the opening words of Georges Didi Uberman's Devant le temps, before time. He then asks, but what kind of time? What plasticities and fractures, what rhythms and jolts of time can be at issue in the opening of the image? Twombly, you'll recall, was quoted in 1994 as saying he had no sense of time. It seems that late in his life he may have had second thoughts. In 2003, at the age of 75, he completed a group of 6 oil paintings and a sculpture under the title A Gathering of Time. That might be an apt description of his entire oeuvre, a gathering of time, his engagement with time taking multifarious forms, engaging the viewer in different ways. In this paper, I've tried to show some of the kinds of time, the senses of time, and Twombly's inexhaustibly rich art. For me, this has been a richly rewarding, revelatory journey. I would be gratified if, in some small measure, it were for you as well. Thank you.
Mark, thank you so much for this wonderful lecture. So thoughtful, insightful, carefully researched. And I think you make a very convincing and solid case that Twombly indeed had a sense of time, or senses of time, as you reveal the different kinds of time that he invokes, historical time, the time of production, of process, and also very significantly the time of viewing. So first I had a question about his inscriptions, and we know a lot more now than a few years ago, thanks to Thierry Grubb's monumental work on the transcription of Twombly's inscriptions, but also, he was able to identify so many sources. And Grubb, in his introduction, reminds us that while many scholars agree that the inscriptions are not just pure sign, they also matter content. Not all scholars have agreed with that. So I wanted to ask you what your take on this is, and whether you see a difference depending on their numbering systems that he makes up, his own inscriptions, or quotations from literature.
Yeah, I could do another lecture exploring census of language or census of inscriptions, which I haven't systematically analyzed, but what I've become aware of is different ways in which they function. For example, I mentioned in The Age of Alexander, which is really the first work that he does that has more than 1 or 2 lines of inscription, and they're drawn from different sources, whereas I suggested it really seems to be just a record of the kinds of mental activity, the phrases that went through his mind as he was painting. In others, I feel, for example, the paintings of the rose gallery on the analysis of the rose of sentimental despair, they become almost like settings of a song, like German Lieder, where those texts, I think, add are enhanced. They're, in a sense, set, orchestrated, composed by the color. And one interesting thing that occurred to me as I was revisiting this lecture, for example, with the issue of progression, which I see coming into his work in 1966, is that the early examples, and he seemed very involved with this in the late 60s and early 70s, they're all abstract. There are no inscriptions. And then when he gets to something like Hero and Leandro, progression takes on a narrative function by means of the text. And the text, that really incredible Leandro really infuses everything there with meaning. I think so. To make a long answer short, I think that texts are performing many different functions at different times in his work, and in that sense, it really reflects his own production. One of the things that I did in preparing this second version of my March lecture was to systematically go to the catalog raisonné of the paintings and to see how he's working in different modes in a given year. He will drop something and then he will revisit it. And so there are many different ways in which the text is functioning, but I think in terms of progression, Twombly becomes very interested in infusing the progression with a kind of narrative sense, and that's a very good example. You could take others like the Battle of Lepanto would be another one, and then of course the Catullus, Say Goodbye Catullus, which has a number of inscriptions from, I think, 6 different sources, which add a sort of tremendous kind of sense of melancholy to that work. So it's something that varies. It's something that I realize in revisiting this material, something that deserves much closer exploration. I think Terry Groeb has done a great service in bringing these together. There, as I recall, 901 works by Twombly out of 3,000, which involve inscriptions. One of the things that I noticed in reviewing is how Twombly increasingly goes from block letters to cursive in his inscriptions. And that too is an aspect of temporality, is that we sort of re-experience, like the Leandro, really stretching out over 3 feet across the canvas. So that's an aspect which I think it goes back to that early statement about the line having a life of its own. But this is, what he does with this, where the letters swell, and it's really the voice and the some of the inscriptions get bigger. For example, the one with the Rilke quotation among the green paintings, the word fishes is very large, so he varies the size. Anyway, that's another dimension of temporality that I think comes into the inscriptions, and it's a fascinating aspect.
Thank you. Very fascinating. I had another question that really was inspired by my interaction with the members of the public recently. And when I was showing them some drawings by Twombly, I asked them what their response was. And, many used the term elusive. Even some said, oh, he's not really collaborating, he's not really telling us what we should be, how we should enter his work, how we should, what we should make of it. And so there's that on the one hand, and on the other, for anyone who knows a little bit about Twombly, we are aware that his works are, very much open works in the sense of, Umberto Eco being works that are highly participative, that are highly collaborative, not only with the viewer, but also within themselves, between word and image. And so if you talk to someone who wanted to understand more about Twombly, but was struggling with this kind of elusiveness, how would you introduce them to this idea of collaboration?
It's a good question. I can only answer it on my own experience and experiences that I had in taking friends who were visiting in Houston to the Twombly Gallery, including people who were not particularly involved with modern or contemporary art. And I was, basically I was pointing things out. I wasn't explaining. I was just saying, look at this, look at that, and found that they were very, very engaged. And in my own experience, this is a really extraordinary journey for me. My 3 months there, I had this vague idea about temporality, and as I said in my lecture, the utopian conditions of preparing this, of living steps away from the Twombly Gallery, and sometimes just dropping in on the way to lunch or something and spending 15 minutes in there, that the act of looking and seeing them in their original dimensions and in space, I felt was really essential. And I found that works that even some of the early works that I show from 1953, particularly 1954, that untitled work from 1954, which seemed in the beginning sort of chaotic, would, upon repeated viewings, just sort of leap off the wall with an incredible kind of coherence. So I think it's a question. It's not easy work. It doesn't easily seduce you. I think some of them do. Some of the later ones, especially. I think that the analysis of the rose, I think those paintings are just incredibly gorgeous and would be very accessible just in purely aesthetic terms. But it's an education for the eye, and I think the thing that my own experience is of looking at these things over and over again and beginning to discover. I mean, what I said about the Age of Alexander, which is, this huge sprawling canvas, the largest thing he had done up to that time, almost impossible to see, and reflecting on one's own act of looking. I think reflecting on one's own act, one's own experience of looking, begins to lead one to a kind of understanding of what Twombly is up to. And my whole lecture, I hope, is sort of proof of that experience and the importance of that experience for grasping this work, because it was a great leap forward for me. I always admired Twombly and was curious, but as I immersed myself in the work, I became more and more in awe of it, and I think it's really the proof of the pudding is in the viewing.
That's a good quote. And I'm so glad we could capture this experience of yours. Thank you for sharing it, this very, indeed temporal viewing of Twombly's work. So thank you again for your contribution, Mark.
And thank you for the opportunity to do this. A wonderful experience, yes. Thank you.